All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Nothing for Nothing Leaves Nothing podcast. I am your host, Lewis. In today's episode, we're going to talk about something a little serious. We're going to talk about trauma. Let's talk about it. Ladies and gentlemen, so here we go. Let's get ahead and kick off this next episode. And like I said, today we're talking about trauma. So, Oxford Language's definition of trauma is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience, a personal trauma like death of a child. Damn, that's pretty drastic. All right, what is the real definition of trauma? Let's look at what they have listed here. This is by mind.org.uk. So our folks over in England, yay. Trauma is when we experience very stressful, frightening, or distressing events that are difficult to cope with or out of our control. Now, when it comes to trauma for everybody is not always the same, and it can come in a variety of different ways. So this topic for me is one of those where you always want to be careful when you bring it up and talk about it, because you never want to offend anybody or downplay anybody's situation or things that might have happened to them. But when you think about trauma, and like in my previous podcast, I was talking about a hive mentality. You can experience trauma, like I said, right? It's something that is very stressful, very frightening to a person. Distressing events, right, can be difficult to cope with. So when you start thinking about events and stuff like that, like obviously your main go-tos would be, losing a loved one, right? That's a sense of trauma. In today's world, we see it all over the place. Like it's just broadcasted all over. You got trauma from domestic disputes. You got trauma from people being molested, raped. Just take your pick. So it's one of those things when you're talking about trauma that it can be very crippling for individuals when they've experienced a traumatic situation, right? For my military folks, you see different traumas. If you've been to combat, been to war, or even if you didn't, just your time in the military, you can come across situations where you do come across a lot of folks that end up trying to commit suicide. And seeing people trying to carry out those acts can leave a scar. It can be something traumatic for you and cause you to have issues. Trauma is one of those things that is broad enough for people to be able to equate to it. But it's also one of the things where you have to look at it from an individual standpoint. In my last podcast, when I talked about people being individuals, from an individual standpoint, that you can see that different things that happen affect people differently. And this is something that I learned when I was active duty. I was a corpsman, like I told in previous podcasts, and I worked in an inpatient psych ward, right, at a naval hospital. And while I was there, one of the things that I realized and experienced is things that you experience may be the same, but how those experiences affect you is very different. That to me was always a mind job in itself, because I would be sitting there having a one-on-one with a patient, talking about why they're there, what's going on, what their situation was. And then a lot of times I found myself, after having those conversations, I would go back, sit at the desk, filling out paperwork or whatever. And it made you think, and you're like, damn, am I fucked up? Right? Like, is my, wiring all together up there in the dome? Because you might have experienced a similar situation as a person you were just talking to. And that situation caused this person to have a mental break, right? Person shut down, slipped into depression, started having, panic attacks and things of that nature, things that are associated with a traumatic experience. And you're looking and you're like, wow, like, what happened? Like, you start trying to figure out, why did we both experience the same thing, but out of that experience, it formulated into something else, and for this person it formed into something very, very serious and very, very damaging for that person. And it's just one of those things, man. Like, you think about interacting with folks where for them losing a parent, and losing a parent could be in several ways. A parent walked out and left them, a parent passed away, a parent being incarcerated, right? Like, things, different scenarios, but are still traumatic depending on how those things happen and how those situations form, can be a very traumatic experience for a person. You think about a person being raped, a person, people being molested, and all of those things, right? And you look at, a lot of times you can sympathize with folks or sympathize with things when you're not directly connected to it. It gives you almost like this cloak that it's not something that you directly have to deal with. So you can be compassionate for a person. You can be like there for a person and try to, help a person through their situation or their trauma. But you also still have to realize that what that person felt in the moment of their traumatic experience, you may never really truly be able to feel that unless it's something you both experience. And then that's when things can get a little tricky, because you experienced it and came out on one end of it one way, and the person experienced it came on the end of it the other way. But it's just one of those things when you think about trauma, and it's like, man, how much traumatic stuff do we see in the world now? I talked about on my last podcast when we talk about like social media and the way things are portrayed, and how the mindsets, people's mindsets are warped into this group and this herd mentality of everybody following the same beat, everybody following the same step. And when it comes to trauma, that's usually never the case, unless you have a group of people that have experienced the same trauma. A lot of times that group can end up having similar experiences or having that similar experience, and it affect them in the same way. And in some cases, one person might come out on one of it little damage, but not as bad. And another person might be completely damaged to where it's something where they literally have to work through. But when you think about traumas, you think about, right, like, how do people deal with trauma? How does trauma affect a person's life after they've already been through a traumatic experience? And that's the interesting part. It's something that I always think about, right? It's just one of those things in life where you sit down and look, and what's traumatic? A stressful situation that's out of your control. Well, what situations can come about that are out of your control that can be stressful to you? A lot, if you think about it. A person losing their job, a person being robbed, a person being around where something like do you have a crazy car accident happen? Just take your pick. Like, there's so many things that can be and cause trauma for a person. An interaction with a person, right? You sitting down having an interaction with a person, excuse me, and that interaction goes bad. And it goes bad in the sense of the person might demean you, the person might just beat you down into the ground. And they always say, like, words cut deep. The tongue is a very, very powerful thing. You can do a lot of damage with the words that you speak and say to somebody. And if you don't realize that, and I know a lot of times when emotions get high and things get heated, people don't think about that, but you can do a lot of damage by just speaking words. People don't believe it all the time, but it does. People, that old saying, right? Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That doesn't hold up to what nowadays, does it? It didn't hold up back then either, for the most part, but it's something that was said because you were trying to, kind of put that shield up to be able to protect yourself. But when you think about traumas, the one thing about trauma, and it's like it becomes a part of your history, it becomes a part of who you are. And the thing I think a lot of people end up going through, and the difficulty that they grow through, comes from, how do you process a trauma? Nobody's mindset is the same. Everybody thinks, believes, and processes things very, very differently. And that is something where it can be all over the place. Trauma is not it's not an easy thing that you can just happen and you just brush it off. Some people can, and some people it takes time. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of effort and just slowly but surely making their way through a process. You think about it. If you were a person that was ever evicted, that's a trauma. People are like, why is that a trauma, man? People get evicted all the time. Yeah, but if you think about it, if you were a person that always took care of your stuff and then you had a situation happen to where something was messed up and it caused you to not be able to pay your rent for whatever reason, now you got an eviction notice. Now, every time you see that, you might be in an apartment somewhere where they have an event and they put a slip on your door. Hey, come party with us. We have X, Y, Z going on. You see that slip on the door and your heart sinks. Now, you can know that you paid your stuff on time. You shouldn't have any issues. Trauma. And trauma comes with different triggers. That's always a big thing when it comes to trauma. You have a trauma and you have a trigger. The triggers are one of those things that you really can't control. And a lot of times people don't know things are a trigger until they start experiencing it enough to be able to identify that, okay, that's a trigger for me. I talked about the eviction thing. Happened to me a couple of months ago. My bank account got hacked and they cleaned me out. Just took all my money. So obviously, talked to them, place I'm staying, apartment, whatever, trying to get stuff figured out, while at the same time trying to get all my money back. And what happened? Got that slip on the door. Open it up. Hey, letter of eviction. And you like, what the fudge cake? I was paying my stuff on time, always good to go. And I got an issue. Now they, but it's a process. It's one of those things. That's how it goes. But I remember recently where, like I talked about an event coming up. They like, hey, 4th of July's coming. Fireworks. Good time. I shit you not, I saw that slip on the door and I was like, what the fuck? Trauma, right? On a small scale, but it's one of those things where you see the slip and you're like, what's up? It just gives you cause for pause, right? That's the way it works. So then you think about traumas of growing up as a kid, right? Seeing different things, experiencing things as a child. What stuff can be seen as trauma? It's a good question. I talk about a lot of times when people need to self-assess and, kind of look deep at themselves and look at your past and kind of think back on some things that happened to you when you were younger and see if any of that stuff if it sticks. And when I say if it sticks, meaning that it stands out to you to where it had an impact on your life. Things that have an impact, especially if it's an impact in a negative way, can be seen as a trauma, like you experienced a trauma. And most people don't think about it that way and like, oh man, it wasn't that big of a deal. It was nothing. About a year ago, I took a class at my church. It was about 6 months long. It was called Peel the Onion. And that was something that they did during the class, right? You go through and it's literally like peeling the onion to your life. And you start realizing, man, that certain things that you experience, that stuff leaves a mark. Most of the things in your life that leave a mark is usually tied to some kind of trauma. Why? Because it's something that happened that was completely out of your control, but it left a mark on you to where it can flare up and be a situation. Always look at things for me, right? Like growing up, and this is, let me get real and personal at the same time. Growing up for me, one thing that I experienced that always bugged me, and I wouldn't say it was a trauma in the sense of like something traumatic happened to you where it was like, oh man, I was physically hurt or whatever. But from an emotional standpoint, my dad used to at times be like, hey, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. Sometimes he came through. More times than not, he didn't. When that happened, crushed, right? Imagine being an 8-year-old kid and you're like, get good grades, do this, and then this will happen. That time will come, it wouldn't happen. So it's like, what the fudge? Like, how many times is this going to happen? And literally every time it happened, crushed. To the point where as I got older, it became a thing where it's like, one, either I'm not asking, or two, just leaving I'm not asking for it. So it eliminates that whole process of having to deal with that piece. But one of the things that came out of that is when I deal with my daughter. If I tell her I'm going to do something, I do it regardless. It can be my last dime, my last ounce of energy, or whatever the situation is. If I tell her I'm going to do something, I do it. And the reason I do that is because I don't want her to feel the same way I felt when my father did it to me. It sucks, right? It's real. This is real stuff, but that's what it was. And even at times, like my brother and I, as we got older, we talked about it. Anybody, look, man, like Pops had his issues. And I'll say that for another podcast and diving deep into that crazy hole of shit. But there's good and bad in everything, right? But sometimes those bad things, man, that shit sticks out and it stays. Now, this is not a bash session, but that stuff does stick, man. And the reason it sticks is because it's one of those things where, like I said, when you experience something, you're like, I don't ever want to experience that again. As you get older into adulthood and you have a child, it's the same thing, right? I don't want my child to experience the negative things that I experience. Trauma. You want to try to avoid that trauma. Now, there are going to be things that they experience that you have no control over. That's fine. But if there's things that you can avoid or pitfalls that you can avoid, you're going to try to do your best to make sure you avoid them. But when you think about traumas, man, you look at a trauma of a breakup. And it's funny talking about this stuff and people are like, man, like, really, how would you consider that trauma? And a lot of times it's something that happened that's out of your control, right? If you're in a relationship with somebody and that person decides not to be with you and they just leave you high and dry and you was giving it their all, yeah, that is considered a trauma. That's something that other person is going to have to work through, right? That they didn't ask for or didn't want to experience trauma. It's the same as when a situation comes up and a person's taken advantage of, right? Talking about somebody being raped. It's one of those things when in the military, it happens. This is not a military bash because I loved my time in the service and all that stuff, but the truth is it does happen to a lot of females. And ironically, the crazy shit is it happens to a lot of males too. I won't get into the details of it, but I've seen it happen and it caused some shit, right? And that situation causing some shit ended up rearing his head for me probably a couple of years later. Completely crazy. And that situation was pretty simple. Individual that was involved in the situation, that individual was a male. He was assaulted, right? And things happened. Didn't see the person for a good while. Finally saw the person again. Hey, what's going on? Small talk, whatever. Didn't talk about the situation, left him alone. What happened? A situation happened between him and a young lady that was with us at the time, and it turned into a whole situation. A situation where people see the show like NCIS and all that type of shit. Yeah, that situation ended up causing me to have to go sit down and talk to these fools in that interrogation room with the little mirror glass, trying to figure out what the hell happened, right? And that was a small situation, but you think about it, that individual experienced a trauma that caused a situation where something even minute that other person thought was completely harmless, had no clue the person had this situation, had no clue the person had experienced this, and what happened? Triggered. It was triggered, and then the snowball just rolled down the hill. So when you think about that and you think about trauma, it's more so being understanding, and when you start to understand people, being around people, be mindful that as people have gone through life, people have experienced different things, and be aware. I wouldn't say you can't be aware unless they tell you, but just give people that little piece. When a situation happened that might be small or minute, and the person has some kind of what most people would say absurd reaction, right? Like, man, why the hell is this person reacting this way? Dude, it's not that serious. It might not be serious for you, but something might have happened to that person that you hit that point, you hit that trigger, right? And people are like, Do what in the world, right? So be mindful. Think about that. Trauma is a very, very tricky thing, and it's a very, very slippery slope. And the reason I say it's a slippery slope is, like I said, it varies from person to person. It's not the same unless you legit experience the exact same thing, but it's not the same. And the process for healing from a trauma is not the same for everybody. You got people that compartmentalize very well and they heal. They find ways to heal from their traumas and they move forward. But the healing process for a trauma, depending on what your trauma is, varies per person. In some factors that I know when I worked in patient ward, one of the doctors was always talking about the different factors that play into a person healing from a trauma over a situation. And a lot of things that played into the healing is, for one, that person's mindset. That person's mindset, and then the things that are around that person. Like, what is the environment or the community around that person? If you have people there that is there to support you, to guide you through, to give you your time, but also there to pick you up when you slip and fall, you heal different. Can you acknowledge your trauma? That's a big thing. It's like, acknowledgement in life is just huge as a whole, because to be able to live and grow from life, you have to be acknowledged the things that you did that were good and things that you did that were bad. You also have to be acknowledged the bad experiences you had and the good experiences you had. That's life. That's how we grow. Life is all about growth. And to grow, you sometimes go through some shit. Sometimes it's stuff that you could expect was coming, and then you got the things, like I said, from a trauma standpoint, that you didn't expect or that you didn't want to be into or have to deal with. But trauma, it's just one of those things, man. Like, when you sit there and think about it, it really, really it makes you stop in your tracks. Because, like I said, traumas can be anything. Like anything. Person, like I said, losing a home, losing a parent. And then you think about that, a person losing a parent, how did they lose that parent? Right? If you have a person lost a parent because the parent was sick, and that parent was everything to a person, right? Like, rock solid, rock star parent, best parent you ever had. And a lot of people feel that way about their parents. Some don't. Some people are parents and some people are not parents. It's really not much you can do about that. You don't really get to pick your parent. You just kind of stuck with what you got. And you make do, the best that you can. But you think about that drama of losing a parent. Whether the parent gets incarcerated. Yes, the parent is alive, but you have no dealings, no way to really interact with that person other than phone calls or scheduled visits or however that breaks down. That's taxing on a person. That's taxing on a person from an emotional standpoint and from a mental standpoint. And then you look at, say, the parent's gone because the parent just left. Think about how many people in the world that a parent walked out on them. Whether a mom or dad. I did my podcast for Father's Day and I talked about it. Like, it's a lot of deadbeat dudes out there that just don't have the gumption or the intestinal fortitude to stand up and be a man and take care of their responsibilities. And that's real shit. It happens. And you think about that, man, like, it always one of those things that trips me out when I'm like, how can you put your blood, something, a child, that person is from you, it is of you, and just leave them out there in the cold? Like, just walk away from them. Like, you have no dealings with them, don't want nothing to do with them, no attachment, nothing. You got to be a punk ass motherfucker to do some shit like that. That's just real. And think about what that does to that child. Now that child grows up with all kinds of fucked up scenarios because your parent walked out on them. Especially if they were of age and it happened, shit's even worse. The kid's a baby, has no recollection of who the fuck you are or that you were ever there. Yeah, it might make it a little bit different, but at the same time, at some point, they're going to ask a question like, why didn't my dad or mom want to be here? Why didn't they want me? That kind of stuff. And think about the trauma that comes with that. Think about all the years of situations and things that come up of a person not feeling love, a person not feeling wanted, a person not feeling good enough because of an individual exiting their life, especially if that person made a decision to clearly exit their life. Now, you go to the flip side of you lose a parent, right? Parent passes away. That's a traumatic experience because that's something that's out of your control. Even if you know the parent is in a state like, well, my grandmother got diagnosed with cancer, right? We knew it was stage 4, prognosis wasn't good. Even knowing that still didn't make the situation easy for my aunties and my dad to know that their mom was, sick and she was eventually going to pass away. Now you take solace in the fact that if you are a believer and a spiritual person, you know that this body that we have is just for the realm that we're in here on earth, right? When you pass away, you return ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and then, your soul goes on to a better place. And people take solace in that. But even in taking solace in that still doesn't make that transition easier, right? You never really get over the loss of a parent. You learn to deal and live life knowing that parent is not there. But that doesn't mean that you like, hey, man, I'm good. I ain't worried about it. No, because you think about that. You have memories. You have different triggers that may pop up, whether it's a food, a smell, a place, right, that will remind you of that person. So it's like it's a constant thing. You just work learning how to continue to live. You think about a person being raped. Think about how traumatic that is for a person from a male standpoint and from a female standpoint. I would never sit here and mince words and say, hey, it's worse for one or the other. It's both equally fucked up on both parts for somebody to take advantage of a person when the person tells you no. But for ladies, think about how bad it is when they get raped and they get pregnant. Now you're carrying a constant reminder of what happened to you. Now, it's not the child's fault, but Trump is one of those topics where you think about abortion, keeping the child, not keeping the child, and all that stuff. Not even get into that ball of that can of worms, but it's one of those things that you think about. Think about for guys, how many, and you see a lot because more so you hear it from different celebrities at times and stuff like that. Not to idolize a celebrity or whatever, but you do see it, right? When somebody is sexually assaulted, when a male is sexually assaulted, the drama and what that does to them from a variety of standpoints. I won't get into none of those because God knows I do not want to be political about dealing with that crazy shit, but it leaves a mark, and that mark can lead a person to live a certain lifestyle, and it could lead that person to perpetuate the cycle, as fucked up as that is. Because depending on a lot of times what happens with that trauma, it becomes perpetuated and becomes normal. And it ends up turning a normal person into a predator. And then you just got individuals out there that's just fucked up like that. So to me, if anybody that physically assaults somebody, they should do something to you. And it ain't pretty. But you think about those things. A person driving a car, getting into a severe car accident, trauma. Person might never want to get behind the wheel of a car again. People, and it's one of those things where people are experiencing things, and if you don't understand a person's trauma or a situation that they experienced, you have to be mindful as your own person to not force things on them or to beat them down for it. A lot of times, like, somebody crashes a car and they're like, man, I'm never driving again. People are like, man, you got to get back out there. You got to get behind the wheel. You can't let this take you down, blah, blah, blah. By all means, it's cool to encourage. But if a person's like, nah, I'm not ready to do it, or no, I don't want to do it, back off, right? Give them their space. I crashed my motorcycle almost 2 years ago, give or take. I still want to get back on the bike. Now, my family would kill me if I got anywhere near a motorcycle. However, it's still something that's there. It's like, for me personally, I'm like, yeah, it's something that I want to do just to be like, all right, yeah, I can still do it. Not to get up there and do nothing crazy, but just to get over that situation. I've had times where I'll be laying around and I just think about the crash. Boom. Hitting the ground at 80 miles an hour is not a fun experience. Trust me. no fun. But it's one of those things where sometimes when I used to drive past that area every day, it would mess with me, right? I would be like, damn, I almost lost my life. Like, I could be dead right now. It's a mind job. It messes with you. It's something that you have to deal with and have to process. Same thing with everything else. Everything is a process. You have to go through it. But you have to give individuals and people their space and their time to process that. That's something that I had to learn. It's not always easy. It's really not. A lot of times you can become selfish in the sense of why didn't this person get over it, you know what I'm saying, and move on. But like I said, the way you process and deal with something, people don't always process and deal with it the same way. But you have to be aware of that and be sensitive to it. I'm not saying be overly bearing about it, but be there to listen to some support, man. Like, give somebody a hand. You never know what that person experienced or what they went through or how severe it is. You can experience something, like I said, and it's like, okay, not that big of a deal, move on. Others experience it and it's crippling, completely crippling. And you think about that and you're trying to analyze it, trying to figure it out. It's not for you to figure out. Hell, half the medical professionals that deal with it on a daily basis still can't figure it out. It's a process. Only thing you can do in those situations is be there as a guide and a beacon for the person and be like, hey man, look, I got your back. You ain't by yourself. You know, we here for you. And hold on through. For my folks out there that are listening, that are dealing with trauma and things of that nature, your process is your process. Don't let nobody rush you. Don't let nobody force you into something. Take your time. Deal with it in the process as you need be. And the reason you have to do that is because understanding your situation and your trauma and understanding what that has done to you and the effect that it has had on you, only you will know, and you have to develop that piece to be able to cope with that, to be able to move on and progress. You never forget the history of things that have happened to you. That's part of who you are. That's part of what makes you the person that you become. But understanding that history and growing from it is the big piece and the big driving force. I think that is something that if anyone takes anything away from this podcast, if you're on either side of the spectrum, and when I mean spectrum, I'm talking about either side of the topic. If you are a person dealing with trauma, or you're a person that's helping somebody deal with trauma, or you just going through life and you interacting with individuals, understand it. People have bad days, and people can have bad days because of stuff that they experienced. Some people go through life and never deal with a real traumatic experience. Kudos to them. You just dodged the bullet in a sense. But for the rest of us, and I think everybody eventually will come across a situation that will become traumatic to them, even if they don't realize it at the time that was a traumatic experience. That's something I think sometimes when I'm sitting back thinking about just things in my life and things that I've gone through and things I've been through, things that I've seen, things that I've experienced. Some things I'm pretty good at compartmentalizing things, but I think there are some things that even there, and like I said, that's what I understood when I went through therapy. It's like some things there that even I compartmentalized and stuff in the box and was like, yo, I'm good. Sometimes you sit down and realize that you're not good. And when you realize you're not good, that is when you have to, stand up, be a man or a woman, and identify and own your shit. Things are not always easy. Sometimes you got to process things to be able to get to the other side, to be able to be a better person, and to learn and to grow and to become an individual that eventually could be there to help somebody else and support somebody else in their situation. Not saying that you always want to know how to do it and do it the best way, but you'll do it the best way you know how. And in this world and in this life, I believe that everybody should be able to just be a good person, right? Just be the best person that you can be, to be the best version of yourself that you can be. And becoming the best version of yourself is understanding the things that you've experienced and the things that you've been through, even the rough and traumatic stuff, it all plays a part in forming you as a person. Even if you experience stuff later in life, when things happen later in life is usually like when you lose a parent and you've gone through life. They've been there for big moments and things and all that kind of stuff. And then now all of a sudden that person is gone. It's rough. It's not an easy thing to experience. It can be something devastating. Becoming you having an experience near death. That was mine. Having friends that have committed suicide. Traumatic. Having a friend that was murdered. Pulling up the pictures and seeing the sidewalk covered in his blood. Knowing that somebody took his life over something stupid. It's a trip. Having buddies that committed suicide. Like, I got one, and when I found out, it crushed me. And the reason actually, the two individuals, they both hit hard, and I'm gonna say they hit about the same. And the main reason they hit about the same is because both of my boys had daughters, and I have a daughter. Right. And if you've gone through life, and everybody's had, I'm not going to say everybody's had a moment. I've gone through different points in my life where I've had times where I thought about taking my own life. It's not an easy thing to process. It's not an easy thing to deal with. And it's one of those things where when you're going through the shit that you're going through, and you're trying to figure out which way is up, which way is down, left, right, and all that type of shit going on. Sometimes you just feel like, man, the only way out is just to end it. Right? Shut it down. And to get to the other side of that for myself, and understanding that, like, my daughter will always be, for me, a beacon to push through no matter what the hell's going on. No matter how rough shit gets, no matter how fucked up a situation may be. That little girl didn't ask for anything, but she's here on this planet. Gift from God. Can't go wrong with that. Greatest thing God can give you as a child to take care of and to raise. So when you think about that, I know for me, that's always my beacon. Shit gets rough, you're tired, you're exhausted, you don't have energy, whatever the situation is. But when I see her little face, man, that just keeps me pushing through. And that's why I said my two buddies that took their life, that's what fucks me up about it. Because both of those dudes, I knew how much they love their daughters, how much they love their family, and to think and realize that you got friends that are in a situation that they don't know which way is up, which way is down, left or right, and they eventually end up at that point where they take their own life. And it's like it's one of those things where it's like, damn, right? Like, even the love that they had for their child wasn't enough to keep them from, making that decision. And that's not a knock on my boys, man. Like, I love my boys. And it's one of those things, like, it sucks. Like, it sucks. Because you can't call them, can't text them, can't check in on them. And it's one of those things where you're like, how does it happen? Right? Try to wrap your brain around it. Try to figure out what got them to that point. but it's trauma. Things that they experienced that left a mark that they were constantly working through, trying to figure out, trying to make sure that they were able to keep functioning, keep going on. And crazy thing about being a vet and talking to other vets and stuff like that is it's one of those things that happens for folks, man. Right? Sometimes guys get to that point where they just don't know which way is up or down, and then, they end up taking their life. And yeah, like I said, I was in that spot. I've been there. And like I said, my catalyst, my beacon, like I said, is my daughter. Can't leave my gremlin high and dry. Can't leave my gremlin solo dolo. Right. I got to be there to make sure she's good. Make sure she's taken care of. Make sure she knows she's loved. She's just got to do my part as her father to make sure she's good. And yeah, man, it's a trip. Trauma is no joke. It's not some shit you can just brush off and pass to the side. The things people experience and the mark that experience leaves on a person is indefinite. Trauma is not something you can erase. It's not something that you can just kind of poo-poo it in a sense. Now you do get folks that when they experience a major traumatic situation, they tend to black out, and it ends up in a space where it's a box that gets sealed away in their brain that they don't ever open to deal with. But like I said, triggers, man. All it takes is the right trigger, and that door opening, the floodgates will flow. So, like I said, to my folks, that if you've experienced trauma, you've seen it, you've been around it, you've had a situation that left that mark on you. Most of us in life, as you go through life, you might have several different categories, different ranges, different impacts, but we've all gone through and experienced something. How that experience affects you will vary. It will be different. But always know that you have to take your time, process it how you need to process it. If you need help processing it, obviously reach out for the help. There's many sources and outlets out there for folks to be able to do that. But I will always say, stay strong. Don't feel like you're by yourself in the situation. Reach out to your friends or close friends. I was talking to a buddy of mine the other day, and I was like, man, the crazy thing is, I know for a doubt, at any given point in time, if I picked up the phone and called him, he'd be right there. And I told him vice versa. Pick up the phone, call me. You need something, I got you. And we just cool like that. You can't go wrong when you got people around you that's they got your back. And having multiple people like that to have your back, it's a good thing to know that even when you can be at odds ends with people, at the end of the day, just because you're at odds ends with somebody doesn't mean the person doesn't care. Doesn't mean that the person ain't there to look out for you. Because at the end of the day, the nature of a person is always true. Right? So you're never always going to be on the same page as you go through life with the people around you, the people in your life. But know that those people in your life are there for a reason, regardless of what you feel or what you think. And the real ones, like the ones, like I said, you can pick up the phone and call them and they like, yo, I got you. They ain't asking no questions. They ain't doing none of this. They're like, what you need? I got you. And those, like I said, those are people that you lean on when you're going through situations, going through traumas. If you're going through an experience of trauma, take a step back and look and see if those individuals are in your life. See if you have people around you that's like your your no shitters. If you need something, they got you. And use that as a resource. Lean on that. Tap into that and use that to make sure that no matter what's going on around you, what's going on in your life, you're not alone. You're not by yourself. Like I said, traumas, they happen. We may not always understand why they happen. I'm a strong believer that God never gives you nothing that you can't handle. And a lot of times people get upset and get angry with the man upstairs because they feel like, they ask why. A lot of times it's like dealing with your child. They ask why, and they might not always get the answer to the why that they want. But understand and know that, man, like, nobody is ever truly alone, especially if you're a believer, because God always got you. And he's always going to put people around you to make sure that he got you, no matter what. So I say in closing, trauma is a rough thing. It's not something that's easily dealt with. It's not something that you can control. It's not something that you can eradicate or erase from your life, especially once you experience a situation. It will always be there. It would always, at some point, it may flare. The thing is, you just have to make sure that you do the work to be able to brace for it when it comes. And if it's help and stuff that you need, I will always seek the help that you need. I will catch you guys on the next go around. I appreciate you guys listening to the podcast, listening to me talk. And like, comment, and subscribe, man. Like I said, on the YouTubes, you got your comment boxes down there so you can leave comments, drop some knowledge, give your insights on the topics as they come about. And we'll look to see if maybe down the line in the future we can start pulling some folks on to have a nice little conversation / interview with and dive deep into some topics. I still want to get back into relationships part 2. I feel like that was a fun one. But yeah, man, keep listening. I'll keep rolling them out as best I can. And I will catch you guys at the next podcast. Y'all have a good one.